Imagine if the world you knew, everything just vanished. Today, we're diving into one of history's most dramatic moments, an ancient apocalypse that didn't just wipe out empires, but actually forged the very foundations of the classical world of Greece and Rome.
Our whole story kicks off with a puzzle inside a fancy Roman house in Pompeii. Now, this is a real mosaic. It shows Alexander the Great, a Greek hero, winning a battle that happened 400 years before the house was even built. So why on earth would a wealthy Roman use prime real estate on his floor to celebrate a foreign hero from centuries ago?
Well, the answer is way more interesting than he just liked the art. It's all about a deep, shared cultural DNA. That mosaic, it's a clue. It's a symbol of a legacy that connects the Romans all the way back to the Greeks, and then even further back to an older world that had to be completely destroyed before they could even exist.
To really get that legacy, we have to jump in our time machine and go way back, long before Rome, to an age of glittering palaces and powerful kings. Welcome to the Late Bronze Age. Just take a second to look at the sheer scale of this timeline. From the beginning of the Bronze Age to the collapse we're about to talk about, we're looking at more than 2,000 years. For century after century, powerful cultures like the Minoans and Mycenaeans built a stable, interconnected world. But as you can see right there at the end, that stability was about to absolutely shatter.
And it was a busy place. You can kind of think of it like an ancient version of our globalized world. You had the undisputed superpower Egypt, which dominated everything economically and militarily. But there were other heavy hitters too, like the Hittites in modern-day Turkey, the Mycenaeans over in Greece, and powerful kingdoms in Mesopotamia.
So, how did these massive palace states actually run? Well, picture the central palace as a giant warehouse and the #1 employer. It would collect basically everything the surrounding lands produced, grain, olive oil, you name it, as taxes. Then, it would pay everyone who worked for the state, from soldiers to potters, not with money, but with rations from that central stockpile.
And all these great powers were deeply connected. They actually had a common language for diplomacy, Akkadian cuneiform. They made alliances by marrying their kids into other royal families. And they traded all sorts of luxury goods across the Mediterranean, wine from Greece, cedar from the Levant, copper from Cyprus. It was really a sophisticated, international club for the elite.
For centuries, this whole system created incredible stability and wealth. But all that complexity, it was also its greatest weakness. In around 1200 BCE, the whole thing broke. This is the story of the Great Collapse. In the span of a single generation, this glittering world of palaces and kings, a world that had stood for centuries, it just disintegrated. It was a catastrophe on a scale that's really hard for us to even imagine today. To really get a sense of this disaster, just look at what was lost. In Greece, the great Mycenaean palaces were burned to the ground. The population plummeted. The complex art of writing was completely forgotten. The trade networks that propped the whole system up, they vanished. For Greece, this was the beginning of a centuries-long dark age. So what happened? It's one of history's great debates, but ancient Egyptian records give us a major clue. They talk about these mysterious invaders they called the Sea Peoples, who they said swept across the sea, destroying everything in their path, even taking down the mighty Hittite Empire. But this wasn't just a military thing. This was a time of massive human displacement. With their entire societies collapsing, huge groups of people, like the Dorians, Libyans, and Aramaeans, were suddenly on the move, desperate to find new places to live, which, of course, led to even more conflict and chaos.
But history is never just about destruction. From the ashes of that Bronze Age world, a totally new era was born, and it was driven by a new generation of innovators. You see, the collapse created a huge technological problem. Bronze is made from two things, copper and tin. But the trade networks that supplied all the tin from far-off lands were gone. So without it, metalworkers had no choice. They were forced to experiment with a metal that was way more common, but also way trickier to work with, iron. And through a ton of trial and error, they mastered it. They developed this really sophisticated, multi-step process, steeling, quenching, and tempering, that could turn brittle iron ore into a metal that was far stronger and more durable than bronze had ever been. And just like that, the Iron Age was born. Now, the pioneers of this new world were the Phoenicians. They were descendants of the Canaanites who had managed to survive the collapse in their coastal cities. They were master sailors and traders, and they took to the seas to find new markets and new resources. But their most important innovation wasn't metal. It was information. The old Bronze Age writing systems were incredibly complex. You needed a tiny class of elite scribes who trained for years to control all written knowledge. The Phoenicians, though, they invented something revolutionary, a simple alphabet, where just a handful of symbols represented sounds.
This was an absolute game changer. The alphabet was easy to learn. Suddenly, any merchant could keep his own records without having to hire a professional scribe. This didn't just democratize literacy, it shifted power from that tiny palace elite to a rising class of entrepreneurs. And this powerful new tool spread like wildfire, adapted by the Aramans, the Israelites, and, crucially for our story, by the Greeks.
And that brings us to our final act. We've seen a world collapse and innovators create new tools from the ashes. Now let's see how those tools built the very foundation for Rome itself.
So as Phoenician and then Greek traders sailed west, they brought these game-changing innovations with them. Iron technology gave people new tools and better weapons, and the alphabet gave them a whole new way to organize and communicate. Eventually, these ideas washed up on the shores of Italy.
In central Italy, a people we call the Etruscans were the first to really embrace this new interconnected world. They admired Greek art, architecture, and ideas, and they created this vibrant culture that acted as a sort of bridge between the Greek world and a small but very ambitious city-state in their territory, Rome.
And the Romans inherited a huge amount from their Etruscan neighbors. Core Roman practices, like their method of reading the will of the gods, and even their most potent symbol of state authority, the fasces, that bundle of rods with an axe, were originally Etruscan. Rome, in its early days, was deeply shaped by this culture. And that brings us right back to our mosaic in Pompeii. That wealthy Roman wasn't just decorating his house, he was claiming his place in a story, a grand story that stretched all the way back through the Etruscans to the Greeks, and from the Greeks to the Phoenician innovators who rose from the ashes of that great Bronze Age collapse. He saw Alexander the Great not as a foreigner, but as an ancestor.
So, let me leave you with a final thought. The Bronze Age collapse was an absolute disaster for the people who lived it. And yet, out of that chaos came the innovations that built the entire classical world. It really makes you wonder, if history's greatest advances are forged in the fires of crisis, what might the challenges of our own time be creating for the world of tomorrow?